Julian's eyes bore into mine with an intensity that could only mean one thing. I tried to remain focused on the road ahead, but my heart raced nervously, knowing he was watching me. Was it possible for me to stop driving that moment and join him in the back seat? I badly wanted to put my hand around his neck and pull him into the kind of kiss that would leave him begging for mercy. But I was just his driver. Drivers were not supposed to be thinking about things like this. I took a deep breath and pretended I wasn't aroused by the mere thought of being alone with Julian. But it wasn't always like this. In fact, he hated me. But I guess life had plans. Our story started with one ride order. I wiped my tired eyes as I stood outside the massive gates of Pedro's estate. The grandeur of the property overwhelmed me, making my modest car look out of place, but I clutched the important file in my hands, determined to return it to its rightful owner. I hesitated for a moment, taking in the sheer luxury that surrounded me before pressing the intercom button. A stoic voice crackled through the speaker. "State your business." "I'm John, an Uber driver. I drove a man named Pedro yesterday, and he left his wallet and this file in my car. I just want to return it to him," I explained, holding the file up to the security camera. There was a pause, and then the gates opened just wide enough for me to slip through. As I walked toward the entrance, I couldn't help but feel like an intruder. The mansion loomed larger as I approached, and I couldn't shake off the discomfort that came with being in a place so far removed from my own reality. My mind wandered back to the day before when I accepted a ride offer from Pedro. He seemed like an ordinary man, clad in casual clothes that revealed little about his true identity. Who would have thought that behind that unassuming facade was a person residing in such a grand estate? I couldn't help but marvel at the irony of it all. As I approached the mansion, I found myself daydreaming about what it would be like to work in a place like this. At the door, I was met by a group of impeccably dressed servants who eyed me with suspicion. I explained my purpose, showing them the file as evidence. "We cannot allow strangers into the estate," a stern-looking butler declared, his tone unwavering. "Look, sir, I'm quite busy myself. All I want to do is return this to Pedro. I think it's important," I insisted, frustration building in my voice. As I continued to plead my case, a sleek Porsche pulled up to the entrance. I took one look at the driver, and from his frown, I could tell he wasn't happy with his job. The passenger's side door opened, and a young man stepped out of it. The man's sharp eyes immediately fell on me, and a sneer formed on his lips. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with a rugged handsomeness that hinted at a mix of Mexican heritage. His olive skin had a warm undertone, and his dark, tousled hair fell effortlessly across his forehead. "What's going on here?" the guy demanded, looking down at me as if I were a mere inconvenience. "Master Julian, this guy says he has an important file for Sir Pedro," the butler said. "Look, he left his wallet and a file in my car. I just want to return it to him," I explained again, my patience wearing thin. The guy's expression remained stern as he eyed me up and down before turning away and getting back into the car. I couldn't help but study his back outline for a moment, the way he carried himself with an air of confidence that seemed to come effortlessly. There was something about his demeanor that sparked envy in me, a confidence I often found myself yearning for. The car zoomed off, and I was left standing there. Just as I was about to retreat, contemplating whether this venture was a lost cause, the grand entrance doors swung open, and to my surprise, Pedro appeared dressed in a bathrobe and sporting a shower cap. "It's you from the Uber, you found my wallet and file," Pedro exclaimed. Unfazed by his appearance, Pedro gestured for me to hand over the wallet and file. As I did, he flashed a grateful smile. "I can't thank you enough. You saved me from a lot of trouble. I must have left them in a hurry yesterday." As Pedro examined the returned items, I felt a sense of relief and accomplishment. Come in. I'd love to offer you anything. I'll get my checkbook right now and write you something to show my appreciation," Pedro said, gesturing for me to get into the house. I shook my head. "No, please. There's no need for that. I have to get back to work," I responded, trying to convey my appreciation while maintaining a sense of professionalism. Pedro insisted, but I stood firm. I didn't return his things with the thought of getting something in return. A week later, I was on my way back home when I got a call from an unknown number. The ringtone echoed through the confines of my car, and I hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello, John. It's Pedro. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." Pedro's voice came through unexpectedly but comfortingly. "No, not at all. What can I do for you?" I replied, my curiosity piqued. Pedro wasted no time in getting to the point. "I've been thinking, and I have an offer for you. How would you like to work for me? There's a substantial paycheck involved, and I believe your skills could be quite useful." The proposition hung in the air, and I could feel the weight of its implications settling in. The practical side of me wanted to refuse, to maintain the simplicity of my life as an Uber driver. But who was I fooling? I had bills to pay, and rent due dates crept into my thoughts. "I appreciate the offer, Pedro, but I'm just an Uber driver. I don't have the skills for whatever job you're talking about." I hesitated, my uncertainty evident in my voice. Pedro chuckled on the other end of the line. "You don't want to take my money? Then please take this job. It pays well, and I believe you're up for the challenge. The same as your current job, the only difference is that you will get paid much better. I'll be leaving the country for some months, and I need to be sure I'm leaving my son in good hands. What do you say? You think I'm a good choice?" "Isn't it obvious?" Pedro chuckled. The compliment made me feel proud. "All right, Pedro. I'll give it a shot," I replied. "Great. Come to the estate tomorrow by 9. I'll introduce you to my son," Pedro said, and we exchanged final pleasantries. I couldn't sleep that night. Excitement and worry waged a battle within me. Was I good enough for this? Could I really step into the shoes of a chauffeur for someone like Pedro's son? The following day, my nerves tangled like a ball of yarn as I arrived at Pedro's estate. Imagine my shock when I discovered that Pedro's son was the same guy I saw the day I dropped by to return Pedro's file, Julian. It all made sense now. He looked at me like I was an ant that he could easily crush, and I struggled to keep my composure. This wasn't the time for me to feel intimidated. I silently thanked my parents for having blessed me with great genes that made me tower over 6 feet. The job sounded simple, but I knew it would be tough. I was to drive Julian anywhere between my working hours. Although I would miss driving my car, Pedro had a breathtaking collection of cars, and I was asked to choose which one I was comfortable with driving. Pedro offered me a room in the estate, but I declined. "I'll be early," I said. Pedro nodded and tapped me on the shoulder. As I stood there, absorbing the weight of Julian's gaze, Pedro's voice interrupted the uncomfortable silence between us. "Be nice, Julian," he said, his tone holding a hint of admonishment. "This is the third guy in 2 weeks." I could feel Julian's eyes narrowing at me, but I met his gaze with a steely resolve. The challenge of being the third driver in just 2 weeks fueled my determination to prove myself, not just as an employee, but as someone who could withstand the scrutiny and the seemingly arbitrary demands. However, it became evident that Julian harbored a palpable dislike for me. Snarky remarks and condescending comments became the soundtrack of our interactions. "Do you even know how to drive properly?" he'd sneer, his tone dripping with disdain. "Take me to that park. It's not like you have anything better to do." "What route is this? Were you really an Uber driver?" I swallowed my pride, reminding myself of the paycheck that awaited at the end of the week. As I drove him to these seemingly meaningless places, I couldn't help but wonder about the man sitting in the back seat. Regardless, I sucked it all in. The remarks, the destinations, and the indifference that seemed to emanate from Julian. It became a routine. I found myself at the estate as early as 7 a.m., waiting for the day's adventures to unfold and back home, depending on when Julian decided it was time to return. Sitting in the car for hours on end while Julian indulged in whatever whim struck him was physically and mentally exhausting. The hum of the engine became the soundtrack to my seemingly endless hours on the road. I'd glance at the clock, watching the hands move slowly, marking the passage of time that felt like an eternity while bracing myself for his tantrums. "Can't you go any faster?" Julian remarked, tapping his foot impatiently. "I'm going as fast as I can while maintaining safety," I replied, trying to keep my composure. "Safe is boring. I need excitement in my life," he retorted with a dismissive wave of his hand. One evening, Julian instructed me to drive him to a high-end club late at night. It was the second week as Julian's driver, and I had a feeling he was slowly preparing me for this. I hesitated, knowing the potential complications of such a request. Before I could voice my concerns, Julian dangled the prospect of more money before me. "Come on, John. You're not going to disappoint me, are you?" He smirked, fully aware of the leverage he held. The image of Lisa, my girlfriend, and her wish for a trip flashed before my eyes, drowning out any reservations I had. With a reluctant nod, I agreed to the late-night drive, convincing myself that the financial reward would outweigh the discomfort. I stopped by the club, and Julian slipped out. I noticed some girls in half-naked dresses staring at Julian. I couldn't imagine Lisa as one of them. It would break me. He engaged the girls with his killer smile, and they seemed to like it. There was no hiding it. Julian was handsome, and he knew it. That was a dangerous combination. While Julian made his way inside, I took the opportunity to distance myself from the chaotic scene. Leaning against the car, I busied myself by chatting with Lisa over the phone. An hour later, Julian emerged from the club with a self-satisfied grin on his face. The night had evidently been to his liking. As he settled into the back seat, the lingering scent of excess clung to him like a second skin. I got ready to turn on the car when he stopped me. Unbeknownst to me, a couple of girls I hadn't noticed before stepped into the car. I glanced at them in the rearview mirror, realizing they were part of Julian's entourage for the night. He locked eyes with me through the mirror, a sly grin playing on his lips. "John, please drive carefully," Julian declared, his voice carrying a tone of entitlement that brooked no opposition. I nodded, suppressing any protest bubbling within me. The sound of hushed laughter, whispered conversations, and occasional glimpses of fleeting silhouettes filled the back seat. I tried to maintain my composure, my eyes fixed on the road ahead while Julian's escapades unfolded behind me. "You're such a bad boy," I heard one of the girls tell Julian. I willed myself not to look through the rearview mirror. What they were doing was absolutely none of my business. "Are we going back to the estate?" I asked Julian. He didn't seem to hear me amongst all the giggling and kissing, so I repeated myself. "Would you like me to drive you back to the estate?" I asked again. This time, my gaze shifted to the rearview mirror, and I saw Julian staring right back at me with that sly smile. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, feeling embarrassment and arousal. It didn't make sense. Maybe it was the weather. "Stop here," he ordered. I did as I was told, and the girls stepped out, but not before he handed them some money. So that was it? I was just going to be the driver of some rich, spoiled asshole who spent his father's money as he deemed fit. "What are you doing?" Julian questioned, dragging me back to reality. "Drive." I started the car, the engine breaking the awkward silence. The night's events had left me unsettled, caught between the professional distance I tried to maintain and the bizarre intersection of my personal life with Julian's hedonistic world. The nights continued with Julian's exploits, and the tension between us reached new heights. Each drive became a test of my endurance. Why couldn't he just do these things at the hotel? Julian consistently looked down on me as if my sole purpose was to serve his every whim. Pedro was nice, but his son was the devil. In the third week, Julian's arrogance reached its peak. "Are you generally this slow? I bet your girlfriend gets tired of you," Julian sneered, his words dripping with condescension. This was the tipping point of enduring Julian's constant insults. I stopped the car abruptly, the tires screeching against the asphalt. Turning to Julian, I announced, "I'm done. I don't want to be your driver anymore." "You can drive yourself, asshole." Julian looked taken aback, a momentary lapse in his arrogant demeanor. "You're so funny," he said. When he saw I was serious, he sat up. "I don't know how to drive, okay? Just take me back to the estate. And then you can quit," he said. I scoffed. For someone who can't drive, you sure do give a lot of rules. I'm so sick and tired of you, I replied, shocked at the intensity of my own voice. I didn't know I had it in me. I wasn't usually like this. I prided myself on how much control I had over my emotions, but this was new. I suddenly couldn't control myself. I stepped out of the car, leaving Julian alone in the back seat. "You can't just leave me here," he protested, and a sudden desperation colored his voice. "Watch me," I replied. "Oh, and be careful along this route. There are potholes." "I'll give you money," Julian shouted, stepping out of the car. He rushed to where I was and grabbed my hand. I turned to look at him, and I noticed something different. He was scared. "Please, John, I can't drive. I need you. I promise I'll tone it down. Just get back in." Reluctantly, I got back behind the wheel. "So you really can't drive?" He began a few moments later. This time, his voice sounded less unsure and more vulnerable. It was a weird change, and I noticed it. "My mother died in a car accident." "She was driving," he said in a low voice. I studied him from the rearview mirror, and I found him wiping a tear. Guilt filled me. "I'm sorry, Julian. I had no idea," I said, my voice softened by his confession. The car rolled to a stop at the familiar gates of the estate, and I turned to Julian. "You don't have to pay me, Julian, and I'm sorry about how I reacted some minutes ago. Can you at least pretend to tolerate my presence? I already know you don't like me," I said to him. "I know I haven't exactly been the best passenger, but I don't hate you." "Quite the opposite," Julian said, and let out a small laugh. "Can we start again?" I got that uncomfortable feeling between my legs, and my heart skipped a beat. "Yeah, sure, that would be nice," I said, realizing that this unexpected turn of events might lead us down a different road than the one we had been traveling. The days after that event were surprisingly better. Julian's demeanor underwent a noticeable change. He began treating me with respect, calling me by my name instead of the impersonal driver. Lisa was away on her vacation, the weight of my bills lifted, and an unexpected ease settled into the routine of driving Julian. Maybe taking this job wasn't such a bad thing after all? One afternoon, as I drove Julian, he casually asked me if I had a girlfriend. I nodded, a smile playing on my lips, as I began to tell him all about Lisa, the love of my life. But the more I talked about her, the more I realized one thing. I didn't love her as much as I thought I did. In fact, I cared more about the person I was talking to at that moment, Julian. I quickly changed the topic and began to talk about embarrassing moments I've had as a driver, and his laugh warmed my heart in ways I couldn't explain. That night, I drove Julian to a club. He promised he wouldn't bring in girls to the back seat, as he knew it made me uncomfortable, and I was grateful for that. "You should come," he said as he stepped out of the car. "Thanks, but I'd rather stay out here. Go have fun." "Okay, Mr. Goody Pants. Suit yourself," Julian said, and he disappeared into the crowd, leaving me waiting in the car. After a while, Julian rushed back, panic in his eyes. I wound the window down. "John, you have to help me. This crazy girl that won't leave me alone is here. Pretend to kiss me, please." Before I could even respond, Julian pushed himself through the window. "This better be convincing," Julian whispered, and in an instant, his lips met mine. My heart beat like a drum, and I savored every moment of the kiss. I could feel the warmth of his lips against mine, the sensation both familiar and foreign. I thought about Lisa. Would this count as cheating? I've never cheated before, but oddly, I wanted more. I wanted his hands on my body and my chest on his. I didn't want this to end. When we pulled away, shock washed over me. Standing before us was Lisa, the very person who was supposed to be on a trip. "Told you I was gay now," Julian told Lisa proudly. "What the hell, John? I thought you loved me," Lisa exclaimed. I couldn't believe my eyes. I stepped out of the car, hoping that my eyes were deceiving me, but it was really her. It was Lisa. He forced me to kiss him just to get rid of you. Weren't you supposed to be on a trip? I asked angrily, looking at her outfit. She was dressed like one of the girls Julian did things in the back seat. After all I did for her, she chose to be one of them? Julian's gaze shifted between Lisa and me. Wait a minute, he said. This is your girlfriend? Not anymore, I replied bitterly. You can have her. John, I can explain, Lisa said, approaching me. I moved back, avoiding her attempts to reach out. In silence, I entered the car, and Julian got in minutes after. I drove out, leaving Lisa there, a sobbing mess. As I drove, I felt a mixture of emotions, stupidity, anger, sadness, and a profound sense of being used. Julian sat quietly in the back seat, perhaps realizing the magnitude of the chaos he had inadvertently caused. I couldn't bring myself to look at him. I clenched the steering wheel and tried to maintain composure, but the raw emotions beneath the surface threatened to spill over. Julian, sensing the heaviness in the air, broke the silence. John, I didn't know it was her, I swear. I glanced at him through the rearview mirror, skepticism etched on my face. Save it, Julian. Just save it. The next day, I slept in, the weight of recent events still lingering in my thoughts. As I checked my phone, I noticed missed calls from both Lisa and Julian, but their attempts to reach me didn't elicit much concern. After all, it was Pedro, my employer, who deserved my attention, not his son. Julian's calls were likely another self-centered request, a whimsical desire to be chauffeured around for his indulgences. What did he even do with his life? Did he ever have to work a day in his life? It seemed like his existence revolved around endless nights of partying. As my phone rang again, I sighed and answered, anticipating another one of Julian's demands. Hey, can you drive me to a bar? The audacity of his request was infuriating, and I couldn't hold back my frustration. Unbelievable, I muttered as I cut the call, unwilling to entertain his whims any longer. I went back to bed, refusing to let Julian's entitled attitude disrupt my peace. The following day, still entrenched in my decision to distance myself from the chaos Julian brought into my life, I composed a text message expressing my intent to quit. However, what happened next was beyond anything I could have anticipated. A knock on the door disrupted my thoughts. As I opened it, I found Julian standing there, an uncharacteristic unease in his eyes. Against his known phobia of driving, he had taken the initiative to drive to my house. Something in me shifted. John, I know I messed up, and I can't change that. But I want to make it up to you, he stammered, a sincerity in his voice that I hadn't heard before. I was taken aback by the sight of Julian's hands shaking. Without waiting for me to respond, Julian continued. I've never really apologized to anyone, but you deserve more than what I've given you. Get in the car and let me try to make things right. I'm sorry. Surprised by this unexpected turn of events, I hesitated for a moment before deciding to get in. I'll drive, I said, taking the keys from him. Julian nodded, seemingly grateful for my acceptance. As I settled into the driver's seat, I couldn't ignore the palpable tension in the air. So where do you want to go? I asked him. A bar, he replied. It's close. We reached the bar, and I insisted on staying in the car, but this time, Julian refused. I'm here because of you, he said, with an earnestness that caught me off guard. I don't understand, I replied, my confusion evident. I know you're heartbroken and sad and mad at me, but let me make this up to you. Today, feel free to drink as much as you want. Drink till your heart's content, Julian insisted, a small smile playing on his lips. My eyes lingered on his lips for a moment longer than I intended. The memory of our staged kiss flashed in my mind, a moment that felt strangely significant. What was Julian doing to me? Why was he able to elicit such thoughts? Who's going to drive us back? I asked, trying to ground myself in practicalities. Julian stared at his still shaking hands. I'll just call an Uber, he said, looking back at me. I agreed, and we entered the bar together. The atmosphere inside was a blend of hushed conversations and the clinking of glasses. In an hour, there were over 7 empty bottles on our table. Julian sat opposite me, silently watching as I poured out my heart. I talked about Lisa, the emotions pouring out with every word. I may have insulted Julian in the process, but he remained stoic, never reacting to my drunken ramblings. His eyes remained fixed on me, an unwavering gaze that felt both comforting and unsettling. In that inebriated moment, a realization dawned upon me. I wasn't heartbroken because of Lisa. In fact, it had been a while since my heart truly belonged to someone else. Alcohol gave me a sense of liberation and courage to ask questions I wouldn't dare in a sober state. If anything went wrong, I could easily blame it on the alcohol. Why did you drive here? Why did you drive to meet me yourself? I slurred my words, the effects of the alcohol evident in my speech. To apologize, Julian replied quickly, taking a sip from his cup. I swear I didn't know Lisa was your girl. I knew her from a few years back. I'm really sorry. I observed that Julian wasn't much of a drinker. While I had gone through 6 bottles, he had only consumed 1. The disparity in our alcohol consumption raised questions about his nocturnal activities. If not drinking, maybe he smoked? It seemed like the only reasonable explanation for his frequent late-night escapades. You could have ordered an Uber, I suggested. I know, but I chose to drive to you instead, he admitted. The alcohol-induced haze clouded my thoughts, and a bold question escaped my lips, fueled by the liquid courage coursing through my veins. Do you like me? I asked, my heart pounding as I awaited his response. You're a great driver, Julian replied nonchalantly. And if I didn't like you, I would have had you fired the second day, he continued. His response made me smile. He ordered more drinks, and I drank to my heart's content. As the night wore on, laughter replaced the initial tension, and our exchanges became more genuine. Things changed after that. He transitioned from being my employer to a genuine friend. Julian insisted on sitting beside me in the passenger seat, claiming it was to see me better, a sentiment that left me both amused and intrigued. As we spent more time together, I discovered that Julian had a job, debunking the notion of him being a spoiled brat. The specifics of his job were surprising and unexpected. He was a curator at a prestigious art gallery. However, despite his assurances, Julian continued to bring girls to the back seat, indulging in passionate moments that left me seething with jealousy. Every time I heard him giggle with a girl, I wanted to scream. I plugged in earmuffs, but they did little to nothing. I could still feel the tension in the air. Unconsciously, my eyes darted to the rearview mirror where I found Julian's eyes on mine. Unable to bear the situation any longer, I stepped out of the car, something I'd never done before, and waited for them to finish. After a while, Julian called me back in. Are you okay? He asked me. Can she leave first? I said, addressing the girl beside him. The girl shot me a disdainful look and turned to Julian. Your silly driver wants me to leave, honey. Tell him to mind his business. In that moment, Julian's anger flared. Get out! He snapped at the girl. And his name is John! I watched in disbelief as the girl hurriedly exited the car. The air inside the vehicle was charged with tension as Julian turned to me. I can't be your driver anymore, Julian, I announced. And this time, I meant it. The emotional turmoil was too much to bear. I couldn't continue driving him while my heart yearned for something more. Is it about money? I'll pay you more. I'll double it, John, Julian pleaded. Not everything is about money, Julian. I am in love with you, I screamed, the truth finally escaping the confines of my restrained emotions. The silence that came after was the hardest part. It told me everything I needed to know. I was just a fool wishing for something that could never happen. I'll just drop you off at the estate, I finally said, my voice steady despite the emotional turmoil within me. The rest of the ride passed in silence, each passing moment exacerbating the ache in my chest. The reality of stepping away from Julian, from the role that had become more than just a job, settled in with a painful clarity. In the following months, the void left by Julian's absence proved harder to fill than I had anticipated. I informed Pedro that I could no longer drive for Julian due to personal reasons, and surprisingly, Pedro was understanding. Julian is difficult. He's been that way since his mama died. But as much as I really like you, John, your mental health is more important, and my son is undeniably an ass, Pedro remarked with a touch of humor. His words provided a momentary respite, but the echoes of my unrequited feelings lingered. I struggled to slip back into the routine of an Uber driver, my mind often wandering to thoughts of Julian. Despite Lisa's persistent calls, I made it clear that a relationship with her was an impossibility. As the days turned into months, I found myself yearning for an unlikely reunion. I secretly wished for Julian to knock on my apartment door, just like he did before, but it never happened. He never called, and he never came. Then, one day, a ride request came in from someone named Jules. My first thought was disbelief. It couldn't be Julian. He probably had multiple drivers by now. Nonetheless, I accepted the ride and headed to the pickup location. To my astonishment, it was indeed Julian. "Geez, Julian, you ride Uber now?" I exclaimed, unable to hide my surprise. He settled into the passenger seat, and the realization struck me. He looked even more attractive than before. "We need to talk," he said. "Don't you have somewhere to be?" I questioned, a mixture of curiosity and skepticism in my voice. "I've been looking for you, John," Julian confessed. "What? Me?" I asked, feigning nonchalance. "But you knew my apartment." I didn't know what to say. I wanted to come, but I didn't know how you'd react, especially after that night. "I want you back, please. You're the best driver an asshole could ask for," he explained. "You always have to be so self-centered, right? I told you I loved you, and you said nothing. Now you're here asking me to come back as your driver. That's not happening, Julian," I said, catching my breath. "Oh, I see," Julian responded, his eyes searching mine. "What about as my boyfriend?" I stared at him in shock, the sudden proposition catching me off guard. "Look, I never did anything with those girls. I swear. I had to explore the experiences of sex workers. It was a controversial project, but I needed to understand their lives to capture the essence of their stories," Julian explained. "John, I've been a fool too. I didn't know how to express myself, and I pushed you away. But these last few months made me realize I can't let you slip away. I want you, not just as a friend, but as something more," Julian admitted. The weight of his words hung in the air, and for a moment, I was speechless. I saw that look in his eyes, and I knew he was telling the truth. I need time to process this," I finally stammered. Julian nodded. "Take your time. I just didn't want to lose you without giving us a chance." "Okay, I'm done," I said after a few seconds. Without hesitation, I pulled Julian close and kissed him passionately and deeply. The moment was heated, but the space was small. "Back seat?" Julian suggested with a playful smirk, and I couldn't help but chuckle at the suggestion. Julian and I started dating after that. We did everything together, and our days ended with us naked and under the sheets. I loved him, and he loved me too. I couldn't be happier. One afternoon, I drove Julian back to the estate. He had spent days in my place, and he wanted to grab a few clothes. We were shocked to find Pedro there. "Surprise!" Pedro exclaimed. "Dad!" Julian exclaimed, rushing to hug his father. "You didn't tell me you were coming back today." "I wanted to surprise you. I see John decided to return back to work," Pedro said, giving me a warm smile. "Actually, Dad, he's my—" Julian began to say before Pedro cut him off with an announcement of his own. "Look, son, before you go on and declare something brand new, I have something important to tell you," he began, excitement evident on his face. He pointed a hand in the direction of the door and began. "I brought someone. Remember Sophia? You told me a year ago that if I wanted grandchildren that bad, I should find you a wife, right? Well, I did." Sophia walked in at that moment, and my breath caught. She was the epitome of beauty, and Julian's enamored gaze confirmed that he felt the same way. "Hi," she greeted us in a soft voice. We both exchanged greetings with her, and before Julian could utter another word, someone unexpected made an entry. It turned out to be someone we least expected to see after all the drama of the past. It was Lisa. "Hey guys," she said with a smirk. "I'm Sophia's sister." The room froze, and I found myself caught in a drama more complicated than anticipated. The end question. Do you believe it's possible to transition from being an employer-employee to friends or even lovers, as seen with John and Julian? Share your experiences in the comments. Thanks for watching. Consider subscribing to become a part of our Rainbow Force, and stay wholesome.